Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for this webinar is identifying potential markets for commercial behind-the-meter battery storage. We have with us a guest speaker from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. This webinar is hosted by Clean Energy Group as part of our Resilient Power project, and our host for this webinar is Seth Mullendore. Seth is a project director here at Clean Energy Group. Before I pass it over to our guest speakers and our moderator for this webinar, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. All of our listeners are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to connect to the audio portion of this webinar. You can join using your computer mic and speakers, which is the default option when you log in. You can also call in using your telephone if you prefer. There's some instructions on your screen for how to do that. If you'd like to minimize the control panel for the webinar, you can click on the little orange arrow that we've circled in that little picture there. A very important note, we ask that you please submit your questions as you think of them throughout the webinar, and we will answer as many questions as we can. At the end of the webinar, we'll save about 15 minutes. We have a lot of people that are on the line already, and we expect to have a lot more, so we won't be able to get to all of the questions. Make sure that we can get to yours by typing it in early, and don't wait till the very end to submit your question. A final note, this webinar is being recorded. We will send you a follow-up email within about 24 hours with a link to the webinar recording and to the slides. You can also find all of our previous Resilient Power Project webinars on our website at resilient-power.org. Oops, sorry about that. I had not let you see the housekeeping slide. Sorry, everybody. So, with this taken care of, I will pass it over to Seth Mullendore to get the webinar started. Seth?
Thank you very much, Sam, and thank you to everyone for joining us today for the webinar. First of all, I just want to introduce you to who we are at Clean Energy Group and our work here. Clean Energy Group is a national nonprofit. We are completely funded by foundations. You can see our supporters here. We also have a sister organization called the Clean Energy States Alliance, which is a membership organization of groups that manage state energy funds for clean energy projects, so things like system benefit charges. For the past 3 years, we have had a joint project with the Meridian Institute that is called the Resilient Power Project, which is what's bringing you the webinar today. The Resilient Power Project was really started in the wake of Hurricane Sandy and has continued as hurricanes continue to hit the United States. Originally, it was put into place because so many diesel generators had failed during Sandy, and we thought there must be a better, cleaner way to provide backup power for vulnerable citizens. The goal of the project is to increase awareness of resilient power technologies. We've really focused on solar and battery storage technologies and increasing the availability of those technologies for most vulnerable communities, so low-income communities and otherwise disadvantaged communities. In that work, we engage in with city officials and state officials in setting up policies to promote resilient power programs. We also work at the federal level some. And we also work with individual project developers as well as city planners in actually getting projects deployed. In that work, we do have a small technical assistance fund that was set up by the foundations to provide some technical assistance for pre-development costs, so figuring out the technical and financial feasibility of resilient power projects. Through the course of the project, we've expanded resiliency not only to include resilient power, but also to include the economic benefits that solar and energy storage can provide to end users. So making clean energy technologies cheaper and making energy cheaper for particularly for low-income communities. We put out a lot of reports. We've done a lot of newsletters and webinars. You can see a few of the reports down below. All of these resources, as well as toolkits for developing resilient power projects, are available on our website, resilient-power.org. I would encourage you to check that out. We'll have a recording of this webinar as well as others and a lot of information, including number of blogs, frequently asked questions, how to put together a resilient power project, and examples of projects that have already been done with featured installations and a project map across the United States. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to the panelists today. I'm going to be starting things off, and I'll be your moderator for questions at the end. Please do submit questions as we go along. We got a lot of people on the line today, and we're going to try to get to as many questions as we can, but please submit as we go along. Joining me today will be Joyce McLaren from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, where she is a senior energy analyst. And her expertise is in the area of renewable energy market and policy analysis, with current efforts focused on emerging markets for distributed solar paired with battery storage. Joyce's past work has covered utility rate designs for distributed solar, the impact of policy design on adoption, and electric vehicle grid interactions. In addition to market analyses, she provides technical assistance to state and local decision makers, municipal utilities, and other stakeholders. Dr. McLaren holds an MS in Community Development from the University of California at Davis and a PhD in Science and Technology Policy from the University of Sussex in England. So with that, I am going to give you a brief introduction and some background information on a white paper that was recently released by National Renewable Energy Laboratory in collaboration with Clean Energy Group, talking about a survey of U.S. demand charges. So to start that off, I'm going to just give you a brief overview of what this project did. Like it says, it's the surveys of U.S. demand charges. So what that means is that based on the utility rate database that Joyce will talk about more, that NREL has compiled, looked at analysis of more than 10,000 utility rate tariffs for utilities across the country, from all of the 48 contiguous lower states, looking at rates that are available to about 70% of commercial buildings in the U.S. This map here shows the maximum demand charges for each utility territory that was looked at in the survey, with the darker colors representing higher demand charges. Again, we'll get into this more as Joyce presents some of the results from the study. A few of the key findings from what the analysis found, and you can find all of these in the white paper that was put out. Biggest takeaway is that nearly 5 million commercial customers in the United States, which represents more than 25% of the customers analyzed in this study, can have the ability or are eligible to subscribe to utility rate tariffs with demand charges at a level where battery storage may make economic sense. And that's at the $15 per kilowatt threshold. We will get into a lot more about what that means and where that number comes from. Interesting takeaways is that there were significant opportunities for storage to make economic sense across the country. And this is not just in the first mover states like California and New York, which people usually think of when they think of battery storage and these advanced technologies. But some of the highest demand charges and some of the biggest market opportunities actually exist in states that are not typically known for high energy prices, such as Colorado, Nebraska, Arizona, Illinois, and Georgia. Really, every region of the country was found to have some market potential for energy storage in combating demand charge prices. So I'm going to mention a little bit about why this is important, what this study means. It really achieved two different goals. One is providing transparency. Most people don't know what demand charges really are, or what the landscape looks like across the country. There's not a lot of transparency into that, even though it can make up a lot of a customer's bill. The other thing is the potential for battery storage, and that's why I have this slide up. This is showing the cost declines of different battery storage technologies over time. The study really looked at lithium-ion batteries. As you can see from several market analyses, about 95% of the battery storage currently being deployed in the United States is lithium-ion batteries. It definitely is the biggest market opportunity, biggest market leader at this time. As you can see, costs have really declined over the last few years and are expected to decline into the future. Some would say that these are rather conservative cost projections that are represented by Navigant Research here. So the other big takeaway from this, in addition to providing transparency into what demand charges are and what levels they exist across the country, is looking at these opportunities for behind-the-meter battery storage systems, that's customer-sized systems, to lower demand charges for customers and decrease costs. So what are demand charges? Along with monthly fixed fees that everybody has, commercial customers are typically billed for electricity in consumption with energy charges. Those are per kilowatt hour. Most people are familiar with those. That's probably how your home charges are seen. It's just kilowatt hours. And then there's a demand charge component, and that's measured in kilowatts. This is usually just for commercial customers, so there's some residential customers in the U.S. that are subject to demand charges as well, but it's pretty rare at this time. So a little just graphic here to show you the difference between consumption and demand. If you look at the first two buildings there, Building A and Building B, you see Building A has lights on, all the lights on throughout the day. So it has very high demand throughout the day. Building B doesn't have many lights on in the morning, then the midday it has a bunch of lights on, and then a bit fewer at night. So it has less consumption because it's running and using less energy throughout the day. But because the midday use of energy is the same as what Building A has throughout the day, they actually have the same peak demand. You can see in the Building B scenario 2, it's actually showing how you could store energy from the beginning of the day, either solar energy that gets produced or energy from the grid, and discharge at midday to lower that peak demand. I'll show you a little bit more about how that works in a couple of slides here. So who is subject to demand charges? As I said, it's commercial customers mainly, but nearly all medium to large commercial customers in every state are subject to demand charges. That's not universally true, but it is largely true. And we're not just talking about businesses here. This is a wide array of commercial customers, which could be community facilities and public buildings and multifamily housing properties. Most people think of things like apartment buildings as residential units, but they also have common area lighting, offices, elevators, laundry rooms, things that are common to the building, which are usually billed under commercial charges. So even though the building is largely residential, it does have commercial charges. So a lot of nonprofits are subject to these commercial tariffs, even though you don't think of them as commercial customers. How customers are billed for demand. So the problem is that there's actually a lot of different ways that customers are billed for demand. Joyce will get into this a bit more later on, but typically customers are billed for demand based on what's called as their peak demand, which is their highest average electricity usage over a defined time interval throughout the billing period. So some usually utilities bill for 15-minute increments. So if you have one 15-minute increment where you use a lot of energy, then that would be your peak demand for that month, for over that period. Demand charges, again, even though people don't know a lot about them typically, they can account for 30 to 70% of customers' bill. That's often the case. And as I said, they can vary considerably across utility territories, locations, building sizes, and building types. Even the same building in the same area may have very different commercial demand charge structures, which makes it very difficult to figure out how those prices work. This is just a quick look at what an energy bill might look at. This is looking at annual energy costs for an affordable housing property in San Diego. The big takeaway here is just that the demand charges, the blue charges there, basically account for about half the bill. And you can see the components of that demand charge. You can have different demand charges in different times of the day, the peak and off-peak times, as well as different times of the year, so summer and winter. Sometimes people are billed for what are called coincident charges, which means that the utility has a peak demand period, and they may be higher during that period, whereas non-coincident means just kind of any time throughout the day. And here's a quick look at what we're talking about when we say that batteries can help reduce demand charges. So this is a 24-hour load profile for a hypothetical building. The dark line at the top shows their energy demand at any time. Basically, the area under that is showing their consumption throughout the day. What batteries can do is if you were to deploy a battery, you could basically manage that demand at a certain threshold. Here it's about 65 kilowatts. Anything above that dotted line in the red area, the battery would deploy then. So your peak demand would be lowered from about 100 kilowatts to about 65 kilowatts, so a 35 kilowatt reduction. And just to put that into context, if you had $15 per kilowatt demand charges, that would account for a little over $500 per billing period and over $6,000 per year. Just running a few numbers, if batteries cost about $1,000 per kilowatt hour and you had a 40 kilowatt hour battery, you would end up with about a 6-year simple payback on that battery. So just a very simple look at a high-level look at what the economics can look like. And that's without any incentives. So I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to turn things over to Joyce to get more into how the methodology of what the study actually did and some of the results, and really dig into what the analysis looked like. Once again, please do submit your questions along the way, and we'll answer them at the end. Okay, turn it over to you, Joyce.
Thank you, Seth, and thanks to CEG for having me today and for partnering on this effort as well as many other efforts at NREL. We really enjoy working with you. So I believe I can advance the slides here now. So today what I will cover is a little bit of background on why we did this analysis and some of the questions we addressed, as well as questions that we did not address by this analysis, and go over the methodology, why we chose a $15 threshold for our analysis, and the data sources that we used, which were all they are all publicly available data sources, some of our assumptions, and then get into the results and the relevancy of the work. So over the past few years, there has been an increasing amount of discussion across the storage industry about value streams and for distributed storage. And a key value stream that has come up is demand charge reduction. So this slide is showing 3 different reports that came out in 2016 that indicate that demand charges are a very strong predictor of whether behind-the-meter battery storage is economical. One of these is a GTM, Green Tech Media report. One was a journal article or a report by NREL, and another by McKinsey. So this topic has been of increasing interest, yet we realized that there really was an information gap out there, that there's not a lot of accessible information, as Seth said, about demand charges, where they are, how high they are, how many customers are paying them. And we heard from industry partners that they were combing through rate sheets to identify where the high demand charges were located. This is a super time-consuming effort. And it occurred to us that we might just have the pieces that we needed to fill this information gap. Quite honestly, it turned out to be a bit more difficult than we originally imagined, but we tackled it. So we set out to answer: how prevalent are commercial demand charges across the U.S.? How high are they? How are they dispersed? And how many customers, could we estimate how many customers might be paying these demand charges, or at least be eligible for a rate that has one of these demand charges? And we use this threshold of $15. So why a $15 threshold? A number of the studies that were listed on the slide, the previous slide, indicated that $15 might be a key number, a key figure. And a study that I am currently working on it also indicated that $15 might be a key figure. So this chart here is showing an analysis, some data from an analysis that is ongoing, that looks at 270 different combinations of building type and location to determine whether storage is economical in each case. And the axis here shows the percentage of cases in which storage was economical based on the optimization modeling. So it's showing 4 different price points and showing that as the cost of storage technology declines, that the number of cases in which storage became economical was increasing. And what you'll note by the circle is that this was occurring very often in that $15 to $20 demand charge range. So that's why we went with the $15. So I just want to point out a few different variations of demand charges because it does relate to our methodology. A demand charge can be just a flat number. It can be, for instance, the $15 charge independent of the time of day that this peak demand occurred, independent of the season or any other factors. So that's the simplest design for a demand charge rate. There can also be a time of use rate, which is based on, of course, the time of day. For instance, the demand charge, if the peak occurs between 2 p.m. and 6 p.m., then the charge might be $15. At all other times of day, it might be a bit lower, quite a bit lower. So in our analysis today, that $15 number is the number that we would have keyed into. So that would be, we would choose the maximum demand charge based on that time of use rate structure. Likewise, there can be seasonal demand charge structures based on the time of year. Again, we would have chosen the highest season charge. And then there can also be tiered based on how high of a demand there was. So for the first amount of kilowatt hours, you might have a lower demand charge rate. As you use more and more, the rate would be higher. So for our methodology, we were always choosing the maximum demand charge rate. A little bit more about the methodology and the data sources. There were a number of different pieces that we had to pull together in order to answer the questions we were trying to get at. We had to figure out, of course, which utility rates across the country have demand charges and what are they. So for this piece, we used the NREL's utility rate database, which has more than 10,000 commercial tariffs in it. We filtered those tariffs down to remove the very specialized rates, things like agricultural rates that are only relevant to agricultural pumping, for instance, pumping water. So we tried to get at the most common rates. So we ended up with about 8,000 common tariffs with demand charges, or 8,000 tariffs. And we looked at, this amounted to about 2,400 unique utilities. We estimated that this was covering about 70% of the commercial load across the lower 48. We were also needing to identify how many buildings there are out there in each utility territory. And for this, we turned to the Energy Information Administration's CBEX building stock data, which is the Commercial Building Energy Consumption Survey, I believe is that acronym. And that gives us information about the building stock in the U.S. So we took the information for these 10 buildings that are listed here to understand what the building stock across the U.S. looks like. Then we needed to be able to determine which rates that we had pulled from the utility rate database, which of the buildings were eligible for which of the rates. So we had to match the buildings with the rates. And to do that, we needed building load profiles, usage profiles, in order to match those against the rules of individual rate tariffs. So we created building load profiles, energy load profiles from the DOE commercial reference buildings. Those reference buildings were matched up with the CBEX building stock type buildings. So there were, those 10 buildings were matched up pretty well. And so we generated load profiles for these building types across the U.S. in the different climate zones and for different sizes of buildings, so different floor spaces of buildings. So then we had to translate all of this. That left us with a sort of a fraction of buildings that were eligible to have a rate that had a demand charge. But then we wanted to translate that into customers. How many customers does that mean might be subject to a demand charge rate? So to get to the customer count part of it, we again used the Energy Information Administration's data from the Form 861 and applied that to our fraction of buildings, the customer count to the fraction of buildings that were eligible for demand charge, to get at an estimation of the number of customers that could apply to a rate, at least one rate that had a demand charge. So, and then final step, in order to be able to summarize some of these results by state, we looked at the service area of each utility and determined to what degree that utility is working in each individual state, and then assigned it a state based on the fraction of customers that it had in each individual state. So a lot of steps, piecing together a lot of different data sources. So given that, there's quite a few assumptions and limitations of the data that I really have to point out, a lot of caveats that you should keep in mind when you are interpreting and looking at this data. The study really is intended to provide a high overview of current demand charges. And if you are interested in identifying potential markets for battery storage, this data really shouldn't be the endpoint. This is not the final answer. This is just to guide further investigation into individual tariffs in individual territories, utility territories. Also, remember that these utility tariffs are taken from the utility rate database, which is a database that is developed through people literally going into utility rate sheets, reading them, and entering those into the database manually. So there are going to be errors in this. It's just a given. That's why you really can't use this as the final answer as to if you're making business decisions on this. This is not the final answer. It's a high-level indication. The tariffs also, these are tariffs that were entered into the database as of this year. So as you probably know, rates can and do change, and so it's good to remember that the data is not static. So this analysis does not address every question about the storage market. This analysis is not looking at what customers are actually paying for demand charges. So this is only identifying when a customer is eligible to pay a demand charge. Doesn't mean they actually subscribe to that rate. It's also not looking at whether the battery would be economical on any individual building type at any individual location. It doesn't determine whether the customer could actually save money. By reducing demand charges, it only indicates that they could be on a demand charge rate. So, and as I mentioned, the study is using existing rates, and the rates do change. So this is not meant to forecast future markets. So let's having gone over all those caveats, let's dive into what we can see from the data. So here's some of the results. This is the map of the maximum demand charge by utility territory. Excuse me. So as you can tell from the map, the demand charges are very widespread. They are in every state. We have charges of about $20 in literally almost every state of the U.S., of the lower 48. Some of the highest demand charges are in states that aren't typically thought of generally as having high energy prices, as Seth pointed out. States like Colorado, Nebraska, Arizona, Illinois, Georgia. The top 10 table is a little bit easier to see what's going on here. I'd like to point out the wide variation for some of these states. For instance, take Georgia. We have a high demand charge of over $28 down to a median of only $3.60. That's a really wide variation. And this is because the state is served by Georgia Power, of course, in some locations, as well as by a lot of rural cooperative utilities in other locations. So that point is actually going to be a lot easier to see on the next slide. So this map is the one that translates the occurrence of demand charges into the number of customers that are eligible for those demand charges. So nearly 5 million commercial customers are eligible to subscribe to electricity tariffs with demand charges above $15 or above. And as Seth mentioned, that's more than 25% of the 18 million customers in the United States. So as you would expect, you see a lot of dark red, which is the highest number of customer count in California and New York. But I want to point out two other states in particular to make a point about how to interpret the map. So if you take a look at Utah, although it looks like there's a lot of customers in rural Utah with high demand charges, it's really an artifact of the way that the map is made. So this shows the total number of customers by utility territory. So if you had a large city anywhere in that utility territory, the entire territory is going to be colored accordingly. So this map is not showing you that rural Utah, that customers there's a lot of customers there paying high demand charges. It's just telling you that that utility territory in total has that many customers that are eligible for a demand charge of that threshold. Also, you can see Georgia is quite spottiness. That spotty effect of Georgia, again, is from the Georgia Power serving some areas, whereas other utilities are serving other areas. So here's the map with the $20 threshold. When you look at it, you can still see that the top three states are the same, California, New York, and Georgia. And Michigan also still stands out. But we see some new states. And we can see that when we look at the top 10 list for both of these maps as well. For the $20 demand charge, we see some new states of Iowa, Kentucky, and New Mexico coming to the top. So some of the same states across both of these top 10 tables. Michigan, Massachusetts, Texas are both the same, but we have some different ones as well. For $15, we have Colorado, Connecticut, Minnesota, and Ohio in the top 10. And for the $20 threshold, the top 10 includes Kentucky, New Mexico, Alabama, and Iowa. So what does this mean for the distributed storage market? What can we take away from this? Basically, that demand charges are dispersed and varied. We usually think of the storage market as really being limited to California, New York at this point. But it is possible that there are other locations where customers could benefit from distributed storage if they are subscribed to some of these demand charges. Also, a small number of customers with a high demand charge doesn't necessarily mean that there's a small storage market in that location. And that's because some of the largest commercial customers often have the highest demand charges. And that would mean that a small fraction of customers may represent a relatively large quantity of cost-effective behind-the-meter storage. Also, of course, as storage costs decline, additional markets may open up, and utilities are considering expanding the use of demand charges, expanding that into the residential market, for instance. And also utility tariffs, they can and will change as I pointed out before. So one must keep an eye out for changes in trends of tariffs that would open up more areas or even close other areas. So I think I wanted to just keep the best for last, the most frequently asked question until last to keep you all here. And the most frequently asked question that I've received so far is, where can I get this raw data? So we are in the process of uploading the data to the NREL data catalog, which is a repository of data that is associated with NREL reports. The data may not be available today. It's in the process of being uploaded, but it should be available very quickly. To get to that data, you would go to the data catalog at the address here, data.nrel.gov, and search for the title is the maximum demand charge rates for commercial and industrial electricity tariffs in the United States. I believe you could put in any of those keywords and it would probably come up. And the ID number for the data set is number 74. So that data will be available shortly. Other data sources that were used in this analysis are also available online to the public, and the links to those are also on this slide. So that's about all I had, and I'd be happy to take questions. So I will pass it back to Seth.
Thank you so much, Joyce. And it looks like we have a good amount of time for questions, which is great because people did heed our advice to submit questions along the way. We have a lot of them. I want to let people know we have about 300 people attending the webinar, so we have a lot of questions. I am going to apologize. We probably won't get to them all, and I'm going to have to pick and choose a little bit along the way. So if you do have remaining questions at the end, we'll probably go over a little bit answering some of them, but if you have remaining questions, please reach out to myself or to Joyce, and we'll be sure to get back to you in a timely fashion as best we can. So just to start off with a couple of high-level things that a couple of folks talked about, there were a couple of people that asked about kind of reality checking the results. So looking at the potential for demand charges and the potential for battery storage, customers that would be eligible for certain demand tariffs versus the actual real-world reality, which is, as Joyce mentioned, that that's one of the things we don't have from the report. We just know the number of folks that could be eligible for a tariff with a certain demand charge, but don't know how many customers are actually subscribed and subject to those demand charges. So through our work at Clean Energy Group, we have been looking at this for a couple of utility territory areas. And I just want to mention those real quickly to let you know how this kind of pans out in some real-world situations. Massachusetts, at the $15 per kilowatt and above threshold, in the report, we found the potential for about 189,000 commercial customers to potentially be eligible for rates that had those high level of demand charges. We found in Eversource NSTAR territory, which is basically Boston area and Cape Cod, there were about 50,000, more than 50,000 commercial customers that actually were subject to those rate tariffs. So that's just for one of the major territories. We found that out through rate cases that Eversource submitted when they were proposing changes to their rates. So while it's less than the number found for Massachusetts, it's actually in a similar magnitude and actually quite a big percentage of the customers that could be eligible. To counter that, in Georgia, which has a potential for over 200,000 customers, 237,000 customers that could be eligible for those high demand charges, we've been talking to a nonprofit in the area called Southface that works with a lot of the utilities there. And in Green Mountain Power, they had access to some of the customer information for the tariffs that were identified as having those high demand charges. And it turned out about 8,400 commercial customers were actually subscribed to the tariffs that were identified that over 200,000 could potentially subscribe to. So there's a big difference in the reality. But more importantly, the results have allowed us to dig into certain regions and find significant potential for customers to have to look more closely at battery storage and the potential there. Even 8,000 customers in Georgia was quite a surprise for a market potential. So that's just to address that question. Another question that came up some was looking at thermal storage instead of battery storage. And just kind of, was that looked at all? And what was the reason for looking at batteries instead of thermal, and what potential does thermal have? Joyce, do you want to address that question?
Sure. So really, to be fair, we didn't look at batteries in particular for this study. We were just looking at demand charges. We did use that $15 threshold because for battery storage, that seemed to be a key figure. We did not look at any other threshold that has been identified for any other storage technology, so we did not cover thermal storage at all in this study.
Yeah, but I think it is important to note that thermal storage, a lot of folks point to that as being a lower cost alternative for energy storage. So it is important to consider if you're looking at a project. There are a number of technologies that can look at that. Another question that came up from several folks was talking about other value streams for energy storage and if those were considered in this analysis. It was not in this analysis, but I know that you are looking, NREL is looking at that in some other work you're doing. Is that correct, Joyce?
Yes, we have a study that's ongoing that we should have some papers coming out in the next couple of months that is looking at the economics for individual building types in different locations. I alluded to that study in one of the slides, the early slides. And in that study, we're looking at some of the more standard value streams like demand charge savings, and energy charge savings, but also we have some sensitivities around resiliency, valuing resiliency and how that changes the equation, as well as looking a little bit into the frequency regulation market or other ancillary service payments that can be tapped. So please, if you're interested in those studies, either keep an eye out on the Clean Energy Group's website. I think we'll probably have them post those products, or the NREL publications website, or you can contact me and I can put you on a list to be sure and receive those papers when they are released.
Great, and just to let folks know, there are companies out there like STEM and Advanced Microgrid Solutions that are taking advantage of this multiple value stream. Some people call it value stacking that batteries can do. They can provide different services and provide different value streams. So in California, those companies are able to contract with the utilities for capacity contracts, long-term contracts for providing capacity. In addition, they're able to do the demand charge management for customers, and they're able to add those value streams together to bring in multiple revenues for storage. A lot of folks talk about a lot of different things that storage can do, but not all of those are monetizable everywhere, and that's one of the factors limiting some of the potential of storage that folks point out. So another question is talking about the duration of batteries. So we're talking about demand in kilowatts, but batteries also have a duration. So if you have a 1 hour battery, you're going to have, say, a 10 kilowatt battery that's 10 kilowatt hours. So what about the difference in economics for demand charge reduction, thinking about ideal duration for batteries? Is that something that you've looked into at all?
It's not something that we looked into for this particular study, but in general, the duration of the battery is important in terms of how you're going to use the battery. So if you are looking for this battery to provide resiliency, if the grid goes down over half a day's time or 3 days' time, you're looking for a longer duration battery that can be used over an 8-hour period or even longer for a longer resiliency type of battery. If you're looking to play in the frequency regulation market where you are providing a grid service on the order of seconds rather than needing the battery for a matter of hours, then you're looking for a short duration battery. and that the economics do change for those different battery usages in general.
Yeah, great. So here's an interesting question that actually several people mentioned was ratcheted demand charges. So you mentioned those demand charges can be applied in a number of different ways. There are a lot of different ways that those utility rate structures, utility rate tariffs are structured. For those that don't know what ratchet demand charges are, basically it's the highest demand that occurs over some period of time, longer than a month. So this is often over, say, the preceding 12 months. So if you have 1 month that has a high demand, that can be where your demand charge sits at that level throughout the next 12 months until you have 12 months time where you don't go to that peak level. I know this isn't something that this looked at. Is that something that you've looked at in any other cases and just seen what the economics for storage can look like in those cases?
Ooh, no, I don't know of any specific studies here at NREL where we've looked at that. I could certainly check with colleagues if someone had a very specific interest, though.
Yeah, and I know that I have looked at this. There was a property that we helped evaluate, a multifamily affordable housing property in Michigan, in the Detroit area, that had these ratchet demand charges. And so the potential there is it can be pretty significant, because if you're able to lower demand charges on a specific month where they're quite high and they're not that high in other months, you know, you really just have to target that 1 month and have the resources for that to significantly bring down costs. But again, it really depends on how it's all structured. So you'd have to get into the weeds to see how the economics there looked on each individual project. There's a question about smart meters, and this is an interesting question because it's talking about, you know, while demand charges are one component and the load profile is another component, also having access to the data is another big component when you're analyzing the potential economics of demand charges. Is that something you have any insight into, Joyce, is how prevalent smart meters are in places where these potential markets exist?
Well, from what I hear, and I can't say I'm an expert on smart meters, but I think that the deployment of smart meters at this stage is a bit spotty. There are some areas that have received funding to deploy smart meters on a large scale, whereas other areas have no deployment of smart meters. And like the question implies, there is implication to the understanding of how the batteries can best be deployed, best be used, as well as other, other data implications. But I haven't looked at exactly where smart meters have been deployed and whether that overlaps with the data that we came up with here in terms of potential markets based on demand charge reduction.
Yeah, and from my experience, it tends to be some of the more advanced markets like California and Massachusetts are ahead of the game in smart meters. Surprisingly, though, a place like New York, I've heard that's an issue there, getting access to interval data. Generally, customers with larger loads will be more likely to have smart meters deployed because it's cost effective for the utility to keep track of the demand for those customers, where smaller customers, medium-sized customers, it's less cost effective. So I think that might have some correlation on how smart meters are deployed in certain utility territories. A question on the software tools that were used to model this, asking about what was used to determine optimal sizing, degradation over time, useful life, and were all those factors considered in this study? Which actually, I should point out, which Joyce said before, this analysis here didn't actually look at batteries specifically, but in the other work that you've done and the optimization work you were talking about, maybe you can talk about the tools you're using there.
Sure. So in the study that I was talking about that's looking at individual buildings in individual locations and modeling the economics of solar, we're looking at solar and storage either together or deployed separately for those buildings in different locations. We're using an NREL developed model called REOPT, the Renewable Energy Optimization Model. And it does take into consideration all of the factors that you mentioned, the battery degradation and replacement. Really, a lot of different inputs go into the REOPT model. I'd be happy to share information about that model, and of course the studies, the results of the studies will be released in short order, so you can learn a lot more about that model and the results of that study.
Great. There was a question about coincident peak demand. I'll try to explain it as best as I can. Basically, coincident peak demand is that utilities generally will identify a peak period where they know that their system tends to have the highest demand. In some places, that's during the middle of the day when a lot of businesses are operating. In places where there's a lot of solar deployed, usually that shifts towards the evening hours when people are getting home from work and turning on air conditioners and things like that. And utilities try to set a peak pricing period that's coincident with what historically their peak period is. So during that period that they identify, the demand charge will be higher than if it were to occur outside of that peak period when the system level of demand is typically lower. Do you have anything to add to that, Joyce?
No, that sounded exactly right.
Okay, good. So there was a question on the graph showing the cases where battery storage was deployed. I don't know if you could pull that up quickly, where it shows kind of as the decreasing cost where storage was deployed. There was a question, which is actually a question that I asked as well, which is why was storage not built in cases where demand charges were $20 at the $20 level? They actually asked $20 or greater, but you can see on the graph at the $30 and $40 level they are deployed. But it looks like at the $20 level, storage was not deployed.
Right, and that's simply because those $20 demand charge rates were located, those actually happened to be New York rates, and there was just a handful of them, and the buildings that were eligible for that rate with the $20 demand charge, the optimization model deployed solar as being economic, but did not deploy storage in those particular cases. So it's just simply the combination of the design of the rate with the location and building load profile.
Great. Any question about load profiles? I'll take a first pass at this. It's basically asking which type of load is best for a battery payout for demand charge management, a flat steady load or a variable load. And it's definitely the variable load. What they typically look for is a peaky load, so a load that has high demand spikes for a very short period of time. That kind of gets back to the duration question from a battery. You want to be able to deploy the battery to lower the peak by the most amount over the shortest amount of time. So if you have a flat load, it's pretty hard to do peak shaving because there aren't any peaks. And you have to have a battery that lasts for many hours to be able to do that. Whereas if you have a thing that looks like a tall mountain range, you can cut off those peaks and get a better payback. Do you have any insight, Joyce, through the research into building types that may be good candidates for demand charge management?
Well, I can say that in some of our work we have seen buildings like hospitals and large offices get solar and storage deployed more frequently than smaller building types or buildings with smaller loads. So that's one insight that we have had in terms of building types.
Great. And a question about the load profile data, the DOE commercial reference building load profiles. Has that been compared to actual load profiles in any way? Has NREL done any work in looking at kind of verifying those with real world load profiles?
I believe there has been some validation done in the process of developing those, but I don't have the details of that. I could certainly get anyone who's interested in those load profiles and how they were developed and how they are being used and can be used in touch with my colleagues who are experts in that particular data set.
So, an interesting question here, and I think we've got two different types of answers, I'm guessing, from myself and Joyce. It's asking about the regulatory risk, basically the risk of tariffs changing over time as demand charges change. And are they expected to remain stable or go up or down as behind-the-meter storage increases? From my perspective, I would say that utility rates have remained, have increased over time. As we've seen things like efficiency and distributed solar get deployed more, we haven't seen electricity rates typically drop in response to those, even though the energy consumption is going down. So while it could happen that demand charges would go down in response to this, there's only so many levers that utilities can pull. So if they're going to lower demand charges, they're going to probably have to increase energy charges, which again then incentivizes things like efficiency and solar. So I wouldn't expect it to see a big change, but I think NREL has done some research on this, which may provide a different perspective on that. And I'm not sure if you can comment on that or not, Joyce.
Yes, that research is ongoing, and I don't want to comment on specific results, but certainly there is a possibility. Markets do make adjustments, obviously, and there is a possibility that with increasing amounts of behind-the-meter storage deployment, that rates and markets in general would adjust accordingly, such that the value that someone might get out of an additional system could be reduced over time. So really, again, it's impossible to say exactly where or when those type of adjustments would happen or how dramatic the changes would be, but certainly the markets are not, and the rates are not static.
Yeah. So this is a very related question and not an easy one to answer. It's asking, so there's an economic opportunity for storage based on demand charges, but that demand charges typically they're meant to really represent utility sunk investments in infrastructure investments like distribution systems, poles and wires, sometimes capacity as well. So if some customers are lowering them, if a significant amount of customers are lowering them, there may be a cost shift for costs that utilities have already incurred to ratepayers that either aren't able to reduce their demand or don't have the resources to reduce demand. It's very similar to the idea of the solar cost shift. Has NREL done any work at this, looking at the effects of this over time?
To my knowledge, we haven't done any studies looking at the impacts of cost shifts from the storage deployment. The markets are still very, very young. Deployment is still quite low comparatively, and so those types of issues really haven't been looked at in a lot of detail yet. Certainly a valid point, and we do talk about the storage market following the solar markets in some way, so I wouldn't be surprised if that conversation doesn't get louder over time.
Yeah, I think I would point to that in the long term, that lowering the system peak, if you're able to do that with storage, and this would be more the coincident peak, where your peak at the customer level occurs at the same peak as the system level. Lowering that peak, it should provide for a more efficient system and lower costs over time. That's not necessarily saying that that's what's representative of what would happen today, but ideally that's where we would get at with storage as a flexible resource, deploying it when costs are the most and lowering those costs over time. But it's certainly an area that warrants more discussion. So I see we're at 3 o'clock. I think we're going to go a few minutes more, answer a couple more questions for those of you still around. this recording is going to be available, so if you have to drop off now, we'll be sending around a link to the recording and the slides as well, and the report is available online. We'll send you a link to that as well. So right now we'll get to a couple more questions. Thank you. If we haven't gotten to your question, please do reach out and we'd be happy to address it when we can. A couple of questions just on what data is available. Is there data available for Hawaii and Alaska?
This study did not look at Hawaii and Alaska due to the lack of data for some of those data sets that we were working with. We do have data available for some of those data sets for Hawaii and Alaska, so it depends on what data you're looking for. But certainly the Energy Information Administration has data on Hawaii and Alaska, and it's definitely worth checking out their site if those are the data sets you're looking for.
And how about for lower thresholds, for lower demand charge thresholds? Is that data available as well, or is there a way that people could figure out that data from the data that is available?
Yes.
Say a $10 threshold.
Mm-hmm. They could certainly use the data set that will be on the NREL data site to sort for any threshold they were interested in.
So a question about are demand charges more likely to remain in place in one market than in another? And that's a very good question. This goes back to some of the other things we've been talking about the risk of tariff changes. And we've actually asked a lot of folks about this and why demand charges are high in some places and not others. What we've found is that typically it's just a legacy rate structuring that the utility has deployed over time. Some utilities incorporate and bundle the demand charges, the infrastructure charges that demand charges represent into energy charges, and others break them out into demand charges. I know that there are some places that look definitely like they are reflective. A place like Long Island is pretty constrained in their distribution system, so that may be reflective of a place where demand charges are more likely to remain high. But that's about all the insight I have. Joyce, do you have any other thoughts on that?
No, I think that's right, that if you had a location that was constrained or where putting more infrastructure in was going to be very expensive, I would think that would be a trigger for higher demand charges. But again, like you said, I think a lot of it is that legacy factor. Yeah.
So a question about what is the cost of batteries? I know you put in different cost thresholds. Does NREL have some values that it's using right now for battery costs that people can use as a model?
We do. Usually in our studies, we're using a range of different costs to reflect changes over time, changes in differences in markets, different markets across the country, different assumptions that people have. I would mention that the annual technology baseline that NREL puts out every year on technology costs will include storage. So folks should look to that for NREL's official cost assumptions in the future going forward.
Yeah, and just as kind of a off the cuff, what we tend to use here at Clean Energy Group when we're looking at projects, typically we think around the $1,000 per kilowatt hour, but prices really range depending on the project, the technology, a lot of different factors. Typically, larger projects have lower per kilowatt hour costs. Some very big utility scale projects could be as low as, say, $500 per kilowatt hour. Smaller residential style projects could be upwards of $1,200 per kilowatt hour. So the cost really varies quite a lot, and some companies like Tesla seem to be undercutting a lot of folks in their cost projections. So it's a very hard target to hit right now and know exactly. One of the problems with the battery storage technology kind of market potential is that there isn't a lot of transparency into cost and performance data, and that's really something that's needed to advance the market. So with that, Joyce, do you have any parting thoughts for folks?
No, I don't guess I do. I'll just thank you again to the Clean Energy Group for having me today, and encourage everyone to look for the report and the data set when it's uploaded, and encourage you to contact us with any questions.
Okay, great. Thank you, Joyce, and thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I'm going to turn things over to Sam for a few parting thoughts.
Thanks, Seth, and thank you, Joyce, for your presentation. I just want to let everyone know that there's some information on the screen right now about where you can find more information from Clean Energy Group. We have a website, resilient-power.org. You can also find us at cleanegroup.org. We're on Facebook, we're on Twitter. And finally, I wanted to end with a plug for an upcoming webinar. This is going to be on September 27th, and it is featuring the McKnight Lane redevelopment project, which is located in rural Vermont. We thought it might be of interest to folks on this webinar because it also relates to energy storage. So check that out. You can find more information on our website or at this bit.ly address. That's it. Oops, sorry, I keep not advancing the slides. Here it is. So you can find more information on our website. That's it for us today. Thanks, everybody, and we hope to see you at the next one. Bye.